So going a little further along in the book, from the Psalms into First Peter, um, we see there's just some things that can be helpful in our time. It was a time of suffering. Right from the get-go of Christianity, there was a lot of persecution. A lot of people were scattered. In about 10 years after the resurrection, there was a scattering of persecution. And Peter's writing to those people. Peter's probably one of the most relatable guys in the New Testament, maybe all of the Bible, because we see him as kind of like normal, where we relate to him on his good days. He gets it. He's like, yes, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Woo-hoo! And Peter gets congratulated by Jesus, and woo. But in another moment on his worst days, he's kind of rebuking Jesus. He's pulling him aside and rebuking the Lord, or totally denying him altogether, but then preaches a great sermon at Pentecost. He's just the ups and downs and maturing factor in his Christianity. I think we all kind of relate to that. Man, we're not perfect, but God can use us, even us. He's called an unlearned idioti by the Pharisees and stuff. It could have just been an accusation, or it could be true. Maybe he was uneducated. But he writes this letter, which is in sophisticated Greek, which bodes against him in a sense that people think, well, Peter couldn't have written this because he's uneducated, and this is written in sophisticated Greek. But there's some arguments that go against that, and the arguments that say that Peter didn't write it aren't so compelling that it makes me think, there's probably some other writer bearing his name. Okay, so they say maybe he didn't write it because of that an uneducated person couldn't have written it in that Greek. They say that maybe the quotations that he uses are, again, from the Old Testament or from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, but the real Peter would have used Hebrew. They say that the real Peter would have had more emphasis on the historic Christ, but who's to say what a first century fisherman would have written? I mean, it's almost like saying, well, if I was God, I would do it this way. But no, you don't know what you would have done. In fact, if you were God, knowing everything God knows, you'd do things exactly the same way. So, you know what I mean? There's some arguments, but to me, no, I think it's Peter. Just because he calls himself an eyewitness to the sufferings of Jesus and an eyewitness to the transfiguration, makes sense that it was Peter. Maybe it's possible he could have used Silvanus, a secretary, a guy who was a courier for him. Maybe he was the guy who kind of typed it out in typing language back then, wrote it out for Peter, maybe cleaned up the Greek a bit. Maybe it's possible to make it more sophisticated. But think about this. He was a fisherman on the major trade route, probably the most major trade route of the century. He would have to know Greek for sure. He knew Greek language. Greek was very common in the Galilee. Plus, he was a trader. He was a fisherman and selling his fish. Plus, guess what his brother's name is? Andrew, which is a Greek name. Which says to me that he would have been familiar with Greek language. Maybe even his parents spoke it very well. His dad's name was Jonah. That's a Hebrew name, but I don't know what his wife's name was. So anyway, all that to say, I think the letter was likely written by Peter. It was likely written about 58 or maybe early 60s. There was just the beginnings or the rumblings of persecution. May have been just before Nero really stepped up and really nailed Christians. I mean, he was causing people to throw Christians before the lions in the Colosseum, and I mean, that just sounds like, go before the lions. We say it glibly now, or just roll off our tongue, kind of throwaway phrase, throwing Christians to the lions. But think about that. They were crowds of people watching other people being ripped to shreds by animals. That's entertainment. Or Nero also was known for lighting Christians on fire and using them as torches in his garden. That's what the people were facing of the day, those kind of things taking place or bubbling up. And so he's telling them, in the midst of all these crises and things, I want you to have grace and peace. Be at peace. Wow. Sounds familiar. Sounds like the Psalm 37 of fret not. So let me just read this first bit here. It says explicitly, Apostle Peter. This is of the Apostle Peter to the Jews that, well, he says the elect exiles. So it's like the people of the diaspora, the dispersion, the people scattered into the all places of the world. He says those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood. May grace and peace be multiplied to you. Did you catch that? That in the dispersion, in the persecution, was done in the foreknowledge of God for the sanctification of his Spirit unto the obedience of Jesus Christ. It's like, sounds like God meant this for good. It's like the suffering, the crisis, the troubles were meant to shape Christians into more like Christ, who he himself learned obedience through suffering. I mean, even in sports, you find, I remember in some sports I played, you learned more when you were losing. You learned more when you were under pressure, when you were oppressed, when you were losing. And you learn more than when you were just winning and everything going great guns. It's awesome. So maybe it's the same thing spiritually, that we learn more when we're going through tough times. God maybe meant this for good. And he says that the obedience unto Jesus is a result, and the sprinkling of his blood, which means the forgiveness of sins. He says, in those troubled times, in the crisis of faith, in the pain and the doubt and the persecutions, may grace and peace be multiplied to you, like abundant grace. Grace is more than just unmerited favor, though it includes that. Grace is his empowering presence in you to enable you to do all that he's created you to do and be everything he's called you to be. It's his presence in you. That's grace that teaches us to say no to unrighteousness and yes to godliness. It's his grace that empowers us to live this Christian life. It's more than just unmerited favor. That's why Paul asked for grace, being his grace sufficient for him when he was asking Jesus to take away these thorns in his flesh. My grace is sufficient. My unmerited favor, it's more than that. It's the power of his presence in you, enabling you to be all that you're created to be. And peace. Like people say when you're going through struggle times, I don't know where you get this peace. I don't understand this peace. Well, that's right. That's totally exactly right. It's biblical to have peace that passes understanding. So we don't get it even. We don't even understand it. But God gives us a peace in the midst of trial because we have hope, because we are trusting him that he's able to make all grace abound to us, so that in all things at all times, having all we need, we will abound to every good work. Those works prepared in advance for us to do. It's all about his grace. May his grace and his peace be multiplied to you like waves on the seashore, just continually coming up. Hear the sound of the grace. Oceans of grace knocking at your door. May that be applied to you. May you multiply in grace and in peace in these times that we're living in. Oh, we need it, and so do other people. So receive the grace of God, the multiplied grace of God, even through difficult times. He's got you.